All right, so I think that we will get started. Thank you everyone for coming, and welcome on behalf of Ecology Action Center for coming to this conversation about how we can adapt to our changing climate in crisis. So I want to say hi to everyone who's watching on the Facebook live stream, as well as those of you who are joining us here on Zoom. I'm so glad to have all of you here on a beautiful June evening. It shows the dedication of all of you to be here and with us tonight for this very important conversation. So thank you. So I'm just going to say a couple of Zoom housekeeping things to begin with. As I'll plunk this in the chat again, we have automatic generated closed captioning on. So if you would like to have subtitles on the bottom of your screen, if you click on CC, or sometimes on people's screens, it's under More, and you can click on Show Subtitle, and then you'll be able to see that. And there are some settings in there that you can play with as well. So that you can get all of the content. It is automatically generated, so sometimes it's a little clunky, but hopefully it's accurate this evening for all of you. We are in webinar mode, so that means that your mics and cameras are off. You don't have to worry about all of that. You can sit back and relax and enjoy the conversation. We do encourage you to participate in the chat as we go along through the conversation. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see an option for Q&A as well. So if you have questions for our panelists this evening, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A or in the chat, or if you're on Facebook, you can put them in the comment section underneath the live stream, and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions. So I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the land that we're on. This call is being hosted in Chubuktuk, in the Sibiq-Anegadi district, in unceded Mi'kmaq. And it's important to remember that our Mi'kmaq relatives were here and took very good care of this land in reciprocal relations with this land for 14,000 years and beyond, as time immemorial. And for those of us who are settlers here, like myself, I think it's important for us to also reflect how it is that we came to be on this land. And that's connected to why our climate is out of balance, why we even need to be having this conversation. It's connected to the colonial violence and dispossession of land and the genocide that has been happening here, that we are hearing more confirmation about in the news recently. So I want to acknowledge that this is a time of great grief and mourning for all of our Indigenous neighbors across Turtle Island, and a very painful time as more of this evidence of what people had been saying all along has been coming to light. So I encourage all of us, the place where we are here is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. And you can read about those treaties online. They're very easy to Google, the peace and friendship treaties. They dealt with not about giving up land, but about how we would be here together in a good way. And honoring those treaties and the inherent rights of self-governance that Indigenous people all around the world have is really key to how we move forward as a society, and also how we address our climate crisis. It's all bound together and one and the same. So I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat here. One is one of my favorite sites. It's the Mi'kmaq Place Names Atlas. You can learn the name of the place, the original name of the place where you're calling in from. If you want to drop it in the chat, that's fun too. And also a link where you can read the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which is a responsibility that all of us have to know what those calls to action are, and to see how we can make sure that our governments enact them, and that we can enact them the best that we can. And to honor the stories of survivors of the residential schools and all of the violence that we are hearing about, to really honor that and take that responsibility forward to make things right. And that's something I'd like to keep in mind as we go into the conversation. So this conversation is the final event in a series of talks that we've been doing throughout the year about mobilizing for a just and sustainable future. And the reason that we're doing this is that there are public consultations happening right now, from now until July 26th, for our provincial climate plan and the Sustainable Development Goals Act, or SDGA. And these are two very important pieces of government policy that will really set the direction for our communities and our life here in this province for the next decade as to how we develop and how we protect our environment and protect our communities in a way that leaves no one behind. So the reason we're doing these webinars is to give you ideas and inspiration and motivation to help inform you and speak up during those public consultations, so that we can all speak up for the future that we want and the future that we deserve. So there's more links coming at you in the chat here. There's the page for where you can participate in the consultations, as well as a page on our own website with more information about all of how EAC has been engaging, as well as some engagement toolkits and things like that. So the purpose of tonight is to have a great conversation, but also that it inspires you to action, to speak up for some of the ideas that will be discussed tonight. There's lots more of those good ideas in the previous 3 webinars that we've done. One was about community climate solutions, one was about our electricity system, how to transform it, and one was about how we can protect the really vital ecosystems that we depend on. So if you'd like to go back and watch the recordings of those, you can find those on our website there. Already lots in the chat. Hopefully it's easy to find those links. So tonight we're talking about adapting to a climate in crisis. And so the idea behind this theme is that even with the best and most ambitious plans to reduce our emissions globally, we will still be experiencing the impacts of the climate that's already been destabilized. In fact, we're already beginning to experience it. I think yesterday set a new heat record for the northern part of the planet out west in BC. Shattering records at the end of June is not a thing that we really like to see, but we're going to see more of it. It's already happening. And we know we still need to mitigate all of the emissions, but we're also going to need to learn how to adapt. So how can we care for our communities as we move into this future? How can we ensure food security and access to clean water? How can we protect those who are most vulnerable in our society? So it's a very, very important conversation, and I'm so glad that we're all here to have it. And we have some wonderful folks here to share their perspectives and their experience. And I won't talk too long, but I do want to say, unfortunately, one of our original lineup of speakers is not here with us tonight. We were hoping to have Louise DeLille, who is an amazing community water activist in the African Nova Scotian community of South End Shelburne. She works with an organization called SEED, or the South End Environmental Injustice Society. And she was going to join us to talk about the challenges that her community has been facing around access to clean water due to environmental racism, as well as their concerns as a community for the future as climate change affects things like drought and rainfall and availability of water. And I'm really disappointed that Louise can't be here, but it's entirely my fault. I screwed up the scheduling and I double booked it. They're actually having their annual general meeting tonight. So I apologize to all of you, because hearing Louise speak is always a real treat and really important. And we were trying to actually set it up so we could pre-record a message from her and play it to all of you during the session. And the thing about community activists is that they're really busy doing a lot of really important work. And we actually just didn't line up a time to be able to bring her message to you. So I'm sorry about that. But I do encourage all of you to go and learn about the important work that SEED is doing in their fight for clean water and environmental justice. They have a Facebook page that you can go to learn about their work. And they also have a current fundraising campaign on GoFundMe to help raise money for ultraviolet water disinfection systems, because their governments have not helped the community out in access to clean water. They have to take matters into their own hands to equip people to actually make their own water safe. So I encourage you all to go check that out, and please consider making a donation to that important work. And that is about all you need to hear from me for now. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator who's been with us throughout this whole series, Erica Butler, who's a former transportation columnist with the Halifax Examiner, now living and reporting in Sackville, New Brunswick. And she's interested in how individuals and communities solve problems, from the climate crisis to inequality to social justice. So I will hand it over to you, Erica, to guide us through the rest of our conversation this evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Joanna. It's been my honor to be involved in these amazing webinars and to get the chance to learn from all the speakers and presenters. It's been a great experience, and I'm excited to hear from these folks tonight. We have three panelists with us today: Brianna Maxwell from FBM Architecture, David Greenberg from Abundant Acres Farm, and Tina O from No One is Illegal Halifax. I'm just going to introduce each speaker as we go along, and we'll get a couple questions in with them. We do have as Joanna mentioned, we have a Q&A sort of time set aside for the end. So if you have questions, even if they're directed at, speaker number one, just get them in the chat, and we'll all be together, and we'll all be able to have a bit of a conversation at the end there as well. So we're going to start off today with Brianna Maxwell. Brianna is an urban planner with a passion for socially and environmentally sustainable communities. Her thesis through the Dalhousie School of Planning was called Exploring Homelessness, Vulnerability, and Climate Change in HRM. She recently built on that work through the Nudge Global Leadership Program, where she ran community-based systems mapping workshops aimed at discussing how the impacts of climate change overlap with poverty and homelessness day to day. And she's joining us today to talk about those overlaps. Welcome, Brianna.
Thank you, Erica. Love to be here.
So it sounds like you've been doing some really interesting research on the intersections between homelessness and the climate crisis. What are some of the things that you've been learning through your work?
There's been a lot of different things that have sort of come up through this. Way back when I started my thesis through Dalhousie School of Planning, in planning, we weren't really talking about the needs of people who were homeless or people who were experiencing poverty. So I really wanted to see how climate change interacted with those social dynamics. And that's kind of what led me to Nudge and building on this work, but I digress. I think the first thing that I've learned here is that homeless persons are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So like we all know, climate change affects everybody, but it doesn't affect everybody equally. So when we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about people who don't have the capacity to adapt like the rest of us do. So in terms of homeless persons, we're talking about not having a shelter, which means you're exposed to the elements, which means you don't have the resources to be able to, stock water, stock food in the event of, drought or cold situations. So when I sort of mapped this out as part of my thesis, you could see all of the existing vulnerabilities of homeless persons. They overlap directly with the effects of climate change, and not just not having a house. It's also being socially isolated, and climate change having a lot of mental health burdens. The anxiety around what's happening with our climate currently. So that was sort of surprising that I had found this through my work, but that it wasn't really being discussed, at least not in the realm of planning. And when I say planning, I should say I mean more urban planning, so designing communities and neighborhoods and stuff like that. So that was one, that climate change is actively affecting homeless persons, and by extension people who experience poverty. And I should say, when my work is specifically focused on homeless persons, but by extension, that's kind of the end of the line. There's many people who are experiencing poverty who might not be able to afford their house, maybe they're couch surfing. There's quite a few people in that category that there isn't research on. So I've tried to be a little bit more inclusive there. And I think the other thing that I've learned through this is that climate change and homelessness / poverty, there are huge issues. Like even, through my thesis work, trying to talk with people about these things, they just seem so large and incomprehensible. How do I, as an individual, or even as an employee or member of an organization, how do I take action on this? And that was one of like the huge stumbling blocks that I found to actually being able to respond to these two things together. And we can't do just one in isolation. We can't solve homelessness without also looking at how climate change affects that, and vice versa. And I think that kind of leads me to one of the other things that I found out through this process. It's that people care. I kind of started this with the assumption that maybe I was the first one to start looking at this work, because it wasn't really in the literature. It wasn't talked about like in the circles that I was currently in. But the more people I've talked to, at HRM, in the nonprofits, with the service providers, even with environmental advocates, I bring this up and people are like, that is an important issue. We should be talking about this. We should be doing something about it. And, I really wanted to kind of mobilize on that, mobilize or use that energy that I had started with through my thesis, and go into the systems mapping workshops. So what I ended up doing was bring together a bunch of people from planning fields, health fields, service providers, climate advocates, to try and have a conversation similar to what we're doing today, about how these issues overlap day to day. Because the thing is, this is happening now. It's not in 5 years' time. It's not in 10 years' time. It's, people are experiencing this day to day. And like, I think we're still kind of trying to figure out what climate change looks like for homeless persons as they go through their day-to-day lives, and what really we as organizations can do about that, organizations and as individuals. I'm sorry, did I answer your question there? Kind of rambling a little bit here.
No, I think you did, definitely. I mean that leads me to the sort of next thing, which is like, what how can we, what sort of changes do we need to make? What sort of policies do we need to make sure that we have protected highly vulnerable populations? Like you mentioned, people suffering, or people living in poverty or without homes. How do we, I guess, protect them from the effects of climate change, or from these issues?
Yeah, I think the very first thing is recognizing that it's happening now. So again, not in 5 years, 10 years, but seeing that it's happening now, and trying to make changes within our organizations to recognize that. Because I think if you recognize it as part of your mandate or your job, then you're more likely to start taking action on that, and then start looking for small ways to actually make those changes. So if you are a service provider, for example, looking at climate incentives, so possibly retrofitting your space, so also helping with climate change, also helping reduce the costs of upkeeping your building. There's a lot of nice synergies between continuing to work on homelessness and poverty, and tackling climate change and sustainability. So there's a lot of neat ways that they overlap, which I think we should really be looking at. And then also with that, trying to understand people's lived experience. So, me as a researcher, as a planner, I can go through the literature, I can talk to people, I can get a sense of, what is happening, but I'm not there on the ground. Like, if we're going to be responding to the climate vulnerabilities people experience, if we're going to be helping people adapt, we need to know what they're experiencing, and it needs to be change that is appropriate for that population, ideally led by that population. And I should say with that, not asking people to contribute too much, like, because especially when we're talking about homeless persons, they might not have the capacity to become extensively involved in a project. If you're struggling with meeting your day-to-day needs, it's hard to want to or be able to take on another project. So there has to be ways of meaningfully engaging this population and other populations in appropriate ways that fit their situation. And with that, I'm here talking about homeless persons, but that's only one side of a person's identity. It's not just homeless persons who are vulnerable to climate change, and that's something that I think keeps coming up with this. Like, we know that seniors, that youth are also vulnerable to climate change, so it shouldn't just be focused on this is one population that's experiencing this. We should be looking more holistically at our whole population to see where those vulnerabilities to climate change are, so that way we can start to respond to this more holistically. And the major thing too with this is affordable housing. So, through my research, through my community workshops, affordable housing keeps coming up again and again and again, because that is at the root of this issue. If you can't afford a house, how are you going to, be sheltered from storms, from extreme weather events, access services, get healthcare? Like, everything ties back to that. And with that, it's not just putting a roof over somebody's heads, it's giving them the supports to be able to succeed and find a job and deal with any issues that they're experiencing, while also keeping their physical, emotional, mental health intact and helping them grow that way. And when I was going through these workshops, there was a lot of really interesting ideas of how you could combine affordable housing with, say, food security as like two major topics that came up. So again, like, I see so many opportunities for there to be overlap between the topics that people are working on. So housing providers working with climate activists, like, there's, especially when we're talking about such big issues like climate change and homelessness, poverty, you have people working in both areas. But what we really need is people to come together to work collaboratively on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about, like, climate change exacerbates all the existing problems we already have. And I guess it's interesting when there are some solutions, because obviously one of the things we need to do is tackle the existing problems. But it's interesting when you talk about there being an overlap of, because, as we mobilize to solve climate change issues, if we can also be looking at, like, gross inequities in society and tackling those too, it's going to be a win-win if we can manage that. So that's exciting. I'm glad
Yeah,
you're working on that. Yeah.
I'm glad to be working on it too. It's definitely a big topic with no easy answers, but I'm glad to be continuing to explore it, even though I'm no longer in school.
All right. All right. Well, thanks very much for that, Brianna.
Thank you, Erica.
And I will remind people, post away, add any questions or comments that you have for Brianna. You can put them in the chat, and we will get to them at the discussion period at the end. Next up, we're going to hear from David Greenberg of Abundant Acres Farm. David's an organic farmer with over 20 years of experience running a market garden, or CSA, Community Supported Agriculture Program. Abundant Acres is an organic farming operation in Hants County, Nova Scotia. It's noted for its biodiversity. People who visit Abundant Acres notice nut trees, orchards, gardens, natural areas, salt marsh, ponds, perennial plantings, medicinal herbs, poultry, and forests. So we're very lucky to have David with us to share some of his knowledge and experience. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. So our weather patterns have already begun to change as a result of the climate crisis. And in a cruel example, we're seeing sort of the stuff of nightmares happening right now out west and moving eastward. What kind of challenges have you experienced as a farmer, and how has it affected your farm business?
It's actually, it's interesting. When you get older, you get to see things happen, and it's like, oh, wow. Yeah, I remember what it was like 25 years ago, and it's different now. It was so much easier to grow food in the 90s. Like, the first farm I actually worked on was in 1990 in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley. exactly where the forest fires were last year. So it was quite poignant for me to see that particular area burning up, because it's where I first really fell in love with commercial farming. So yeah, like in the 90s and early 2000s in the Naples Valley, it was considered quite common to grow vegetables without irrigation. And hurricanes were like a once in a generation kind of event. I remember when Juan came through, that was such a shocking and scary event that, hadn't happened in a really long time. And now it's like every summer I'm like, I wonder if all my greenhouses are going to blow away. And it's just one hurricane after another. And, so then you think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't use greenhouses anymore. I should just give up on greenhouses. But then the weather will be so erratic that the only reason you can reliably produce vegetables is with greenhouses. So it's kind of like, you kind of feel like, well, I guess I'm just going to build these structures and hope they last for a few years, is sort of the attitude that I think a lot of farmers have now. And obviously, you build structures that are stronger maybe than you would have before. I talk to a lot of farmers too, like, friends, competitors, and colleagues. We always, compare notes. And there are so many different approaches to how to make a climate resilient farm. We've chosen to stay fairly small in our land base and have 100% of our fields irrigated and sort of invest heavily in a small piece of land. Some people take a different approach and they just plant a lot more, expecting losses if it's dry, and sort of have a more extensive approach. That's sort of just on a very, nuts and bolts practical level. On a deeper level, I do kind of feel like having employees live and work with us and get comfortable being outside in the bad weather and different challenges and using their bodies and relating to the natural world to provide food is something that's really important in uncertain times. I really saw it last spring during COVID when our crew was all quarantined together and we were so, just felt really secure and, supremely privileged and happy to be doing what we were doing during such an unusual time in history. And as the events of the last few years keep unfolding, that just gets stronger, that feeling. So I think it's important to get people on the land. I think it's important to get people comfortable with, dealing with the weather, good or bad, or, usual or unusual. Yeah.
I'm not very quick on the unmute button today. Sorry, guys.
All right.
What do you think that we should be doing? You mentioned that, interestingly, you mentioned that farmers are taking different approaches to, to make their farms resilient in the face of climate change. This is really interesting because I don't know if that's like a sort of common knowledge. We might just think that there's one way to go about it. So in light of that, if people are taking these sort of different approaches, what should we be doing as a society to help support that work and those farms becoming resilient, with the end goal being like having a secure food supply, a secure local food supply for everyone? So is there things we can be doing on this sort of provincial or societal scale that can help this?
Yeah, obviously that's a super, multifaceted issue. I know from my personal, from the experience Jen and I have had building this business over the last decade, and just seeing what our other friends who farm are going through, I think when there's times where people get very focused on supporting local producers gain a lot of confidence that what they're doing is actually viable and invest more in their farms and work harder to build a future. So I remember after the 2008 financial crisis, there were several years where it seemed like people in Halifax were really like deeply committed to supporting a local economy. And then I kind of watched as the economy rebounded, the interest in being a locavore waned. And then we saw a similar bump last spring. You know, at the height of COVID last spring, people were so committed to supporting us and telling us how much they appreciated the important work we were doing and thank you. And then now, like as vaccinations roll out and everything kind of calms down, you just sort of see the sales just go down a little bit, and just people are like just kind of back to, oh, I want to go traveling and do this and have fun, and it kind of that emergency mode attitude goes away. So I definitely think that just supporting farms who seem to have values that align with yours is important. I think becoming educated as to what like truly ecological agriculture looks like, and you know how you want to vote with your food dollars is really important. I think the province is just in spite of themselves, they're forced to support small to agriculture in the province almost. It's actually a really interesting situation where like at the Federation of Agriculture and at the Department of Agriculture, a lot of the people who are in charge have traditionally been quite hostile to hippies like me. And yet now their job is to serve the farming public, and the only new farmers are hippies like me. So they're kind of like, well, I guess this is the future. There are hardly any new commodity producers. So I guess we have to deal with these small family farmers who are into ecology. Okay, let's roll out some programs. So that's kind of the situation where you really see how the consumer preferences and just individuals who want to get into this kind of farming is forcing government and the Federation to adapt, which I find really delightful, actually. And it really shows the agency that the public has.
Let me ask this in terms of, you know, I mean, definitely, so I'm hearing you loud and clear there in terms of voting with your food dollars, which is, you know, where you're spending your money, where you're spending your grocery budget. In terms of, you know, when we're, you know, talking to provincial leaders, when we're, you know, weighing in on this new provincial climate plan, do you think that there's, you know, what sort of policies should the provincial government be looking at, or what should we be demanding the provincial government look at in order to better support the farms, small ecological farms?
Again, really multifaceted. I mean, one thing that I think is very sad and frustrating is that there is such a focus on you know, policies around food safety that grossly benefit large industrial producers who generally produce food that, you know, isn't healthy, isn't ecological, is not socially just. And yet the playing field is so tipped towards their success. And of course, the government bodies responsible for regulation have a revolving door with the top executives from these corporations. And so it's so stifling to small family scaled producers to break into many different you know, sectors in the agricultural economy. So that's a very deeply entrenched challenge to face. That, you know, I don't know. It would be great to see a public action on that somehow. It would be resisted tooth and nail. But it's I've seen it up close and personal with friends of mine who've tried to do things like open up a cheese factory and just watch them just have to fight an onslaught of regulation to stop, a small family scale business get open. With vegetables, I think there's a reason why so many people get into vegetable farming when they want to start farming, is because it's largely unregulated. So the barriers to entry are very low. So, for now, vegetable farming is easy to get into, relatively. I do think that public money helping startups is useful, and there are some limited but good programs happening right now. It would be nice to see more of that, and perhaps less of the government spending millions of dollars in wage subsidies for potato chip factories and processed chicken plants and bottled water factories and things like that, and more for growing food that actually nourishes people and the land. But again, huge uphill battle, but that would be amazing. Yeah.
All right, thanks very much, David. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and it's like I think that we have the provincial governments, the bureaucracies tend to focus so much on sort of large enterprise as being a quick solution. If you can support one large enterprise and solve all kinds of economic problems, isn't that easier than supporting 50 small enterprises? And we have that system that's geared to that, and it's unfortunate. Yeah. Anyway, that's that. I really appreciate you sharing that info, and sounds like there's a lot more, and I'm sure we're gonna have questions coming up. So get your questions in the chat panel, everybody. So next up, we're going to hear from Tina O. Tina Yeonju O is a Korean immigrant that grew up in Alberta, where it took her family over 13 years to gain permanent residency status in Canada. She's a grad student at Dalhousie and a migrant justice organizer for No One is Illegal Halifax. She's also a former member of the Canadian Youth Delegation to 3 United Nations climate change negotiations, aiming to pressure Canadian governments to standards of climate justice and historic reparations. O was featured by CBC as 13 Canadian environmentalists and innovators changing Earth for the better, and named one of Canada's top 25 environmentalists under 25 by Starfish Canada. And she's here with us today to talk about the climate crisis and human migration. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks, Erica. Nice to be here.
Really straightforward question to start you off here. Tell us about how the climate crisis is impacting human migration.
Yeah, so it's a big question. I'll try my best to kind of answer that holistically. I have so much to say on this topic. So I might be kind of scattered, but bear with me at the very end. I'll try to pull all the threads connected together. So I'll just start off by saying, by sharing where I'm calling in right now. I'm calling in from Mississauga-Skowhegan, Edmonton, Alberta, where there are record-breaking temperatures and a heat dome of 40 degrees. That's why I'm sitting on the floor of an unfinished basement, because it's the coolest place in my mom's house. So definitely, we're living in the climate crisis as I speak right now. And whenever I talk publicly about the climate crisis, I always make a point to highlight that the climate crisis is right now. And Brianna said this too, it's not distant in the future. Growing up in Edmonton, Alberta, which is it's Canada's most populated northern city, temperatures would rarely ever reach 30 degrees, maybe once or twice a year. And then that was only really when I was in high school. And now 30-degree weather is the standard. And we're now looking at 40-degree weather being the standard, which is extremely scary. And at the same time, this is the same region that faced a polar vortex this winter for weeks in sub 40, 50-degree weather. So this is so unnatural. Like I'm living at either ends of the spectrum where we're having weeks of minus 50-degree weather where you will get, frostbite within 45 seconds of being outside. versus this 40-degree weather where you will get sunburn within, 45 seconds of being outside. So, just to say, this is very unnatural. We are living through the climate crisis right now. This is happening right now. And, I'll just start off by saying, on average, 26 million people are displaced by a climate-related disaster every single year. That is one person forced to flee every second. And that's a statistic from 2016. So no doubt that statistic has increased in the past 5 years because we know the climate crisis is worsening every second of every day. And as the grips of this climate crisis takes over every single continent on Earth, billions of people are losing their homes. They will lose their homes. They're losing their homes right now. And that's who we're talking about when we say the words climate migrants and climate refugees. Possibly that a global majority of the world will be forced to evacuate because of decades-long neglect and government inaction that supports a capitalist-driven corporate society. Something that we really also need to understand when I say climate migrants and climate refugees is that we're not only talking about those across transnational borders. Every time a wildfire blazes through British Columbia or a hurricane hits the coast of Nova Scotia, when people are forced to evacuate from their home, they become a climate migrant. And so there are people within our borders right now who are being forced to evacuate. There's a wildfire on the west side of Edmonton. And of course, like the prairies are just seeing wicked wildfires every single year. And those are Albertans being forced to evacuate. They are climate migrants. 5 years ago, in 2016, the same year that climate scientists said that 26 people would be displaced that year, I was in Marrakesh, Morocco for the United Nations climate change negotiations. And of course, it was a very significant point in the negotiations. It was 1 year after the Paris Agreement was created. So there were a lot of expectations. And of course, there was a lot of hopes and optimism leading up to this conference. And 3 days into the conference, Donald Trump was elected president. And of course, he had been campaigning quite vigorously, as everyone knows, that he would be pulling out of that agreement. So, that set the tone for the rest of the negotiations, where I saw governments and civil servants scrambling as they were absorbing the news that one of the most powerful countries in the world, one of the world's greatest emitters of greenhouse gases, would be pulling out of an unprecedented worldwide agreement on climate, which we know is also still so insufficient. But it's all we had at that moment. And it was gutting, and it was heart-wrenching to see those people scramble to figure out, what are we going to do with the US pulling out of this worldwide agreement? And I remember that day just so clearly, not necessarily because, we had this fascist become president of this, powerful country, but because I had lost so much of my faith in one of the only systems, the United Nations, that is supposedly going to fix our way out of this mess. And the reason why I lost my faith that day is because I had entered into a negotiation room, and the negotiation room was centered around, what are the responses that countries are going to take to address this already ongoing, already compounding displacement issue. And for the majority of the session that day, policymakers were bickering over the legality of word choice. They debated whether we should call those displaced climate migrants or climate refugees. And they spent hours doing that. People argued that we shouldn't use the term climate refugees because the term refugee involves a political factor, such as displacement from war. And I guess people thought that refugee wouldn't be an appropriate word because climate, for some reason, is seen as irrelevant from politics. But we know that's not true because climate crisis is political. And when people are displaced from their homes due to disasters that could have been entirely avoided, that is political. When people are associated with identifiers like refugees and migrants in a country where they are stripped of recognition of their basic rights, that is political. And yet we have governments, civil servants, bureaucracies arguing over the word and term rather than actually getting to action for the real issue at hand. When we have people living in crisis and politicians who are hoarding these resources and bickering over word choice instead of substantial immediate action, that in itself is also inherently political. And that's what I saw that day in that boardroom of the United Nations negotiations, which was entirely insufficient action from leaders and nations. And frankly, a lot of my blame and a lot of the hope that I lost that day is because Canada shoulders immense fault for the situation that's at hand. With any crisis in trying to figure out a solution, we need to look at the roots of the problem, right? So people often refer to, the climate crisis is happening because of capitalist industrialization. Industrialization was really the initial point of making the climate crisis. And while that's certainly true, more and more and more, we're learning actually that climate crisis has way deeper roots than that. Some of the highly cited scientists in the world, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, and I really encourage everyone to look up this paper, released a groundbreaking study trying to define the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, if people don't know what that means, it means essentially the timeline where human activity started to control Earth's ecosystem. And Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, in their study, they look to the date 1610, the year 1610, as a critical timeline for the start of the Anthropocene. And why that date is so significant is simply for this reason. That is when Europeans took hold over many indigenous territories that were not theirs to take. And I'm going to rephrase that again, okay? The attempted genocide of indigenous peoples on their lands, the genocide of indigenous flora, of fauna, of land and people here on these territories, on African lands, on Latin American lands, is reflected in the change of the atmosphere in 1610. Colonization is the root of the climate crisis. The mass killing of indigenous people today and the past 500 years has caused the climate crisis. For millennia, people lived with, alongside, and came from the land without destruction. This is really new in the scheme of how long humans have been on this earth. And so, even though that sounds so overwhelming, to me, it's also a little bit of hope into seeing, our ancestors have been living alongside this planet for millennia, and it's really only within the past 500 years that they haven't. It means that it's fixable, and it means that we can go back, because that possibility has been there always. And this is all to bring me to kind of my main point around colonization and capitalism and attempted genocide, forced migration, displacement. That's how it all connects to climate crisis. And I'll kind of give up another example. So a couple years ago, as everyone should remember, there were tens of thousands of people in migrant caravans leaving Latin America, heading up the border to the United States and Canada. And those caravans were mainly made up of children and their families. And so when we think about, why were they migrating? Why were people, mostly who are indigenous to those territories, why were they leaving their ancestral territories? Because for the past decade, but specifically the past few years, the regions of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador is facing water shortage and the worst drought in recorded history. If people cannot grow food, if people cannot find water, one of the only options you have is to move and to search for it, especially when you have children, especially when you have family. And everyone has family. And so when those migrant caravans attempted to migrate to places like Canada to the United States for asylum, people were denied entrance at the border. And as we saw, children were put into literal cages, into modern day concentration camps and detention facilities that still continue to exist this day. And simply their crime was the movement across an imaginary line that we call a border. And from the outside of that border, Canada and the US is a fortress. It's a fortress that begins actually, and more studies are conducted on this each day, is that more and more our governments are putting billions of dollars into making that border actually farther and farther away. So we're actually preventing the movement of people, not necessarily at the US and the Mexican border, but places like El Salvador and Guatemala, to prevent them from even coming up closer to the US, closer to Canada. So we need to understand climate migration is an inevitable outcome of the climate crisis. The displacement, the dispossession, the climate crisis is happening right now. What are we prepared to do what are we prepared to do and in terms of the climate adaptation that's required of us, which is to take responsibility for the crises that we've enacted on others. And are we willing to acknowledge that migration, the act of movement, is one of the most natural things in life, that human and animals have and are meant to migrate? And are we going to stop the policing of that movement? I'll just finally say, I know I'm close to time. It's no coincidence that the same politicians that are drumming up racist, anti-immigrant scapegoating are the very same politicians that are delaying climate action and denying climate science. It's no coincidence that the climate crisis worsens. Governments like ours respond by tightening its borders. These are very connected things, and the people in power know that. Canada is home to 75% of the world's mining corporations. We are living in a country, we are electing leaders that allow the plummeting of resources and land that is not ours, and that allow extreme violence and assassinations without any repercussions. Could that be why mining corporations look to Canada to house their investments? And so this is really all to say, these things are all connected, and I know I kind of went everywhere, but this is a huge issue, and we have, there's so much power that we have to make this, stop and create something better.
Wow, Tina, thanks. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm glad that it's hard to hear, but I'm glad you're delivering it with like that kernel of hope, which is that it's fixable. It makes a big difference to hear it in that context because it's a little less debilitating to kind of think about. Can you talk a bit about, what you think, even like as on a provincial level, what Nova Scotia could be doing to support migrant justice and the rights of climate refugees? What can we be doing at this level that we're talking about here?
Yeah, for sure. And, this is an essential question. And I know in my previous response to your first question, I was, really focusing on that national lens, but there is so much that can be done at the provincial level, and there's so much that needs to be done at the provincial level because, as governments get bigger and bigger, the more, bureaucracy there is, and there's actual changes that we can enact immediately. And so this is all to say, really what we need is landed status upon arrival. That's what migrants have been asking for decades. When I say landed status on arrival, which is it's a federal issue, and I understand that, and I'll get to the provincial stuff in a second. When we say landed status on arrival, what we're saying is basic rights for everyone. We want basic rights and equal access to services that everyone else gets who have citizenship and permanent residency. We're not looking for handouts. We're not looking for anything extra. We just want what everyone else has, which is just basic rights and equal access to services. And so, that's really what needs to happen because that's going to be the fastest way to make sure that everyone has those basic rights. But in terms of things that the province can do, one of the biggest things is healthcare, right? So people need to understand that migrants who are undocumented or who have precarious immigration status do not have access to healthcare. And yet we are seeing them work in essential workplaces during this pandemic without healthcare or access to the vaccine or access to pandemic supports. Essentially, if they get sick with COVID, they have to pay out of pocket. And, there's so many things at the provincial level. There's healthcare, education for migrant children, no collusion with immigration enforcement, essentially no criminalization of migrants and policing them. And what's so significant about our work with No One is Illegal, who I'm a organizer for, is that most of our campaigns, although we kind of focus on that, status for all at the federal level, we also run a lot of campaigns at the provincial level, again, because we know that the province can be doing more. And so the campaign that we're running right now is Vaccines for All. Again, essentially equal rights and services for all. That's really what we're asking for. And I know people might, be wondering, what do all these things have to do with climate justice? But again, what we really need to understand is that climate migrants are already here. This is not something that's in the future. whether they're here as a migrant farm worker or whether they're here as an asylum seeker because of unlivable conditions elsewhere, which we know, again, as home to 75% of the world's mining corporations, Canada is directly responsible to making those unlivable conditions elsewhere. And so, more importantly, if we're expecting the climate crisis to worsen, which we know it is, and every day it is, we need to start organizing right now. What are we going to do to ensure equality for the people who are already here, and then equality for the people who are going to come? And that's the work that we really need to be engaged in right now. How are we making our society and our community a safe and dignified place for all? Because as the climate crisis worsens, we need to make sure that when people come here, that they are welcome and that they have, you know, the same dignity that everyone else is afforded.
All right, thanks so much, Tina. I see a real connection between your work and the work that Brianna is doing, just in terms of it being really about how the climate crisis is exacerbating these existing issues that we have all, you know, have had for decades and hundreds of years, I suppose. Inequality and the control of migration, I guess, let's put it that way. We have some time now. I want to definitely thank Tina, Brianna, and David for those presentations, but ask them to stick around as we do have a few questions to get to. There was one that Brianna actually answered in the chat, but I'm just gonna ask her to talk a bit about it, because I think that, you know, it's an interesting question and answer. Brenda Ryan on Zoom asked, where do the homeless go to get out of the heat? I understand that shelters don't let them stay during the day. And I think this is an important one, because in Canada, I don't think we're used to the idea that you need shelters from the heat. And it's a new reality that we definitely do. Like, the people who are suffering the most right now at West are definitely the people who don't have a place to go. And if they do, they maybe can't afford air conditioning or climate control in where they are. So this is it's only going to grow as a problem. So Brianna, what was your answer to Brenda's question?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to elaborate on that. So when I was talking to people last year about, you know, how climate change affects homeless persons, it came up that people were already responding to, you know, increased heat events by giving out water, sunscreen, hats, and stuff like this. So trying to help people mitigate the effects of heat, just as in their as they went about their lives. But you also have cooling shelters, which seem to come into effect when you have you know, a heat wave, or when there's multiple days of extreme weather. And it's interesting because, especially right now, where, you know, we were in lockdown all through May, and the library was closed. You know, where do people go to get out of the heat then? You know, if public facilities aren't available, if cooling shelters aren't available, you know, where do they go? And then along with that, what about the sanitation aspect of it? You know, there's not very many public washrooms, at least that I've been able to find in Halifax, aside from, you know, the public library. So it kind of speaks to like a larger issue beyond just, you know, heat. But certainly it is a major issue here, and increasingly so, as we're seeing these days.
There's also a question from Brenda for David, focused on irrigation. Brenda is wondering, David, if you could talk a bit about different irrigation methods and their efficiency. And she's wondering particularly about capturing rainwater. And do farmers capture rainwater? Or is that something that's done, or is that something that is being looked at?
Yeah, it is actually. So we have, it's on just a little larger scale. So there's a two-part question. The first part is efficiency. So we use a lot of drip irrigation. So it's a plastic tube that emits actually 0.22 liters per hour per foot. So it's like a very slow drip that uses maybe 10% of the water per acre than sprinklers would use. So we use that on as much of our crops as possible. The downside, of course, is that you use a lot of single-use plastic to do it. Well, not a lot, maybe, I don't know, 500 pounds of plastic to grow 500,000 pounds of produce or something. So it's fairly efficient, but it saves water. For us, we wouldn't have enough water on our farm if we didn't use drip tape. We also use a lot of micro sprinklers that are just very efficient, even low flow sprinklers that we actually use during heat waves. So one way that we're able to mitigate actual weather like what we had today is we'll water our greens in the middle of the day just to evaporatively cool them. And we can do that with these very efficient micro sprinklers. As far as catching rainwater, our main irrigation pond is set in a low spot in the middle of our farm where when we have a heavy rain event and there's surface water running off, it runs into all these ditches that we have that run through sort of a seasonal water course that fills up our pond. So there's not a creek running into the pond, but when it rains, we catch all the rainwater off of about 10 or 15 acres of land. So in many ways, that is just a giant rain barrel. Yeah, about 250,000 liter rain barrel. Yeah. So yeah, water security is a huge thing. And Nova Scotia, traditionally has been a very consistently rainy place. And it's not anymore. I would say in the last 10 years, we've probably had about 7 dry summers. And it's getting really hard to water without good irrigation. And it's a thing. It's a very expensive, labor intensive thing to set up good irrigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When Tina was talking, it occurred to me that, some of the people that she was talking about, people leaving their ancestral lands, heading for greener pastures, I guess, or green, any kind of green. And I was thinking that, I guess there, but for the grace of God goes David Greenberg. It could be, that's if things get bad enough, I guess it's your livelihood and our food supply that's in jeopardy. That's what we're talking about here.
Indeed.
Yeah. I had a quick question for you, David. You had sort of talked a bit about this, and I was wondering, in terms of regulations killing potential new small-scale food operations, is there like an egregious example or something that to illustrate, a little bit about how that's happening? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think when you mentioned it, it piqued my interest, and it seemed like something that maybe a lot of people don't realize is happening.
Sure. It would be an egregious example would be like eggs. So right now there's a supply managed commodity board, and you're not allowed to have more than 199 chickens on a farm for egg production. So it's very expensive to buy the production quota and extremely lucrative once you're in. So you have this like essentially an old boys network of, multi-generational farms that are really, really big, egg factories that have a monopoly, a government sanctioned monopoly on raising eggs. So if someone wants to, maybe have a flock of like 500, which is it's like, producing like maybe 150 dozen eggs a week, which is like a very nice supplement to a homestead income. The only way to do it is to break the law and, face fines if you get caught. And then there's all kinds of regulations. Like we buy eggs at the warehouse market that we were having our customers return cartons to us. But the larger egg producers have lobbied the Department of Agriculture really hard to outlaw reused egg cartons, because they say they don't want these, ungraded homegrown eggs being sold in cartons that have their farm's name on them. So now the department is really strict about not reusing egg cartons. And egg cartons, you know, have a lot of embodied energy in them. They're ground up trees and they cost 30 cents each. And, you know, it's that kind of pressure, you know. My good friend Ted Hutton mentioned once the health inspector giving him trouble for using reused banana boxes at market, you know, just hassling people for things that just aren't really the problem. You know, it's like, so you have industrial farms that are treating migrant workers atrociously, and you have, you know, widespread ecological disasters, and government decides that hassling people at farmers market for reusing banana boxes is where we have to be investing public money. And, you know, you just think like, who are you working for? You know, when I was involved in setting up a on-farm dairy processing project, a direct example would be they spend about $20,000 plumbing everything in according to provincial regulations, and they had 5/8 inch pipes for this propane to heat the pasteurizer for the milk vat. And then the federal inspector comes in and says, oh no, we're metric, it has to be 15 millimeter. And they say, wait a minute, 5/8 is the same as 15 millimeter. He said, no, it's not. It's a thousandth of an inch bigger. Pull it all out. And this inspector used to be a top executive at a large dairy processing firm in the province. So he made him pull out like tens of thousands of dollars of plumbing and natural gas lines to make the metric. You know, and it's just like, here's this family farm trying to do this thing in their community. And, you know, who are you working for? Where's the justice in that? Where's the, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that, you know, is very corrosive to, I think, you know, people's confidence in a just society. You know, in the sense that you know, whatever, that the government is here to support us doing something good. Instead, it's like everything I want to do is illegal. Everything I want to do, you know, I'm just like, oh, you know, if I just could just do things that make sense, I'd just feel just so much, you know, more free to be creative. Now, on the other hand, farmers grumble about that, and then they're very glad for all the programs that come out, and, you know, and farmers have a lot of entitlements too. We get a lot of money, especially larger farmers, but even smaller farmers are in a very, very entitled position in our society.
Thanks so much, David. This is enlightening.
It's both.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Question for Tina here. Tina, what is the role of individuals when it comes to supporting climate migrants? And this person's also asking, is the term climate migrant or climate refugee more appropriate? Which one do you think is the best?
Yeah, both good questions. I mean, I use them interchangeably because, you know what, we're talking about semantics, and the reality is, even like, there's a fascination and desire to constantly categorize people. And so often, like, a climate migrant is also displaced from other forces because, you know, these are not things in isolation. They are displaced from colonization or extraction from a Canadian mining project. Like, these are all, you know, they're all connected, and there's not just this one easy, very clear frame to say, you know, a migrant is displaced solely because of climate crisis. And so, I mean, I use the words interchangeably. I'll just say that, and I certainly see the benefit to, you know, talking specifically around the issue of mass displacement and dispossession because of climate change. But again, just really recognizing that migrants are displaced from factors that are all interconnected with one another, such as, you know, the things that I just said, and other, you know, violent forces that displace people. And then in terms of the second question, or the first question, which was around what individuals can do to support climate migrants, climate refugees, everything that I had said in my second answer around what the province can do, that is what individuals need to do, because we know, and as David kind of gave some examples there, the province, frankly, is not going to do shit unless we pressure them. And frankly, like, we have been seeing that to be the case. Like, we launched this vaccine for all, you know, campaign, and the government was just months behind in any way, and they're still so inadequate around the vaccine rollout for migrants, many of whom who have not gotten their first shot, even though the government is ramping up those second doses. You know, the inequities are just really palpable. And so when I say we need healthcare, you know, Nova Scotia needs to give healthcare, it needs to give vaccines. What I really mean is that people need to force our government to give those things, because the government on their own will not do so. They've shown us time and time again that they would rather, you know, make a category of people to be illegal and undeserving, or deny them these basic rights and access to services, which, of course, you know, healthcare is a human right, and that's, you know, what we're centering in our approach. And so individuals have the power here. This is absolutely the case. The government does not have the power. The people have the power. We force the government to do the things that we need them to do. And it's often very insufficient, but the reality is that time and time again, we are seeing the government budge and move and shift because of the pressure that we're compounding on them. And so we know we're winning in terms of the efforts that people can do, a collective effort that people can do. And so, yeah, people have the power. Individuals, when they form a collective and amount to collective pressure, like we're doing at No One Is Illegal. And of course, you can participate, and I encourage you to participate in our campaign. And Joanna just put the link in the chat there. We can do some amazing things. And again, we've seen people do incredible things. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Tina. A question came in for Brianna. I'm not totally sure I follow this question, but I'm hoping you can, Brianna. During Hurricane Dorian, there was an issue around emergency shelters being inaccessible to people who use public transit. Is this something that people at service organizations are trying to address for future hurricanes? Does that ring a bell for you, Brianna?
Yeah. So funny enough, I started my research after Hurricane Dorian, so it was a hot topic. Okay. I'm not so sure about the shelters being inaccessible from public transit. I know there was an issue with people on the peninsula not having a shelter nearby. I think the closest one, from what I recall, was at Lacewood, or near the Canada Game Centre. And that was difficult for people downtown who didn't have access to a vehicle to be able to get out there. I myself, I'm on the Halifax Peninsula, and I had no way of getting there without public transit because it wasn't running. And from what I understand, there is an emergency management group that was meeting prior to the pandemic to talk about issues like that. And I think there is some talk, I think at the provincial and the municipal level, with input from service providers on that. That's that emergency management committee. I haven't heard from them in the last year, so I'm not sure what their status is. I have heard about some other research as well, looking at the location of emergency shelters, because we are a coastal city. It's not just hurricanes that we have to deal with here. So I think it is on some people's radar, but I haven't heard any updates recently about it.
Okay, yeah, I think I see what it's about now. So yeah, thanks for that, Brianna. Another question for you, David. And again, it's going to be a big one. then I don't know if you can solve this for us or not, but hopefully you can give us some ideas, right? Because I think what people are looking for is ideas that they can bring to the table when they're going to these consultations on the provincial climate plan. So here's the big question. How can we retain more water or increase water security in our province?
Well, on a farm, that's sort of like what organic farming is all about.
Right.
So when your soil is alive and you do things right, which is basically keeping your soil covered with vegetation or mulch and porous and soft and not burned out with too much harsh chemicals and overworking it, and basically keeping it all juicy and spongy and full of carbon, then when it rains, the water soaks in. And you have that's the basic tenet of good farming. That is, that's it right there. Mm-hmm. So, and then of course, like we have invested so much in building new ponds and deepening the ponds we have so that we're catching our water. And I think, whether you're an urban gardener in the city that has, installs a few extra rain barrels, or you're a farmer out in the valley like me, and you're digging giant ponds, catching that water and storing it is the age-old technique. One thing I'll give you as just a fun thing you can do is set up a swimming pool in your backyard that has your gutters going into it. And I actually myself have a swimming pool that I use for irrigation that we slowly fill and let the silt settle out of it. And then we use it for drip irrigation so it doesn't clog our drip lines and it's easier to filter. And use swimming pools can be really inexpensive on Kijiji, and there's something really practical to think about. Yeah, but I think in general, relating to nature through meeting your needs, farming and living on the land. And I think we have it in us to be creative, and that the biggest step is just engaging that creativity. And in that, meeting our needs, there's this sense of, like, I always find this, that farmers so often are such radically generous people. And it's because you just see the wonder and the beauty of things springing out of the earth and growing and yielding. And that you just want to protect it, and you want to love it, and you want to share it, and you want to get better at it. And it's so fun, and it's so meaningful, and just soul satisfying. And I think more people, hopefully, if COVID does nothing, I hope it inspires people to become more interested in resiliency and community and nature and doing these things. And find people who need help, who are doing cool things, and help them and learn and make connections, and and build a swimming pool in your backyard with a downspout running into it. If you're lucky enough to have a backyard, on whatever level you're at. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, David and Tina and Brianna. Really appreciate you guys spending this time with us and answering our questions. Really generous of you. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the reins back over to Joanna and thank her for the opportunity to be part of this. It's been great. And Joanna has some closing remarks and some information for everyone, and take care.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And thank you, Erica, for, once again, guiding us so beautifully through a really engaging and important conversation and helping to tie all of these threads together. So many really important ideas that we heard tonight around supporting small scale farms and businesses, have the government be a little more supportive of those folks instead of slapping all kinds of unnecessary regulations on you in terms of supporting the big agribusinesses. Instead, we need less of that, more support for the little folks. And obviously public money helping with the startup farms, farms that really nourish people in the land. We heard about affordable housing and anti-poverty, the need for us to collaborate across those different sectors so that the people who are working on serving those most vulnerable people are also working with the folks who are working on climate, and vice versa, that we're coming together across those silos. Stopping the policing of human migration, as it's a natural thing that's happening and is going to be increasing because of our climate crisis that we're in. Getting that landed status on arrival with basic rights and equal access to healthcare and education instead of criminalizing people. And this call also, I think I heard from all of you, around connecting and being creative and forming these collectives where we really can exercise our power together, being creative, loving the land. That really touched my heart. And showing up at these calls to action where there is a moment where we can collectively come together and force our decision makers to actually do something, because as Tina so truly pointed out, they're not going to do it unless we do that. We are their bosses. There's an election coming up soon. And of course, right now until July 26th, the consultations for the SDGA are open. All of these things that we've talked about tonight are exactly the kinds of environmental goals and regulations and policies that should and could be part of that piece of policy. It has the potential to be that visionary. It also has the potential to be more weak sauce. And it's up to us to actually make the difference by showing up in droves. So I've put the link in the chat again. We have another 4 weeks. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, get together. There's our toolkit is there as well. There's a lot of different ways that you can be engaged. And consultation is a one-time thing, but democracy is ongoing. So, stay involved we'll stay connected. Hopefully all of the different links that we shared in the chat tonight are giving us ways of taking action together. Because as Erica pointed out, it's helpful to have a little bit of hope when we talk about these things that are quite intense, to think about these realities. I think a lot of times, I was sitting here and just feeling these, these realities that people are talking about, that I think even as someone who works in an environmental organization, I don't think about every day, and it is intense and it can be really scary. And where I find hope is when we have those collectives of people who come together to fight for a good future and work to grow a good future together, where we can take care of each other and no one's left behind. So thank you so much, everybody. This has been really, really wonderful, and hope to see all of you again very soon. If you have any questions at all about the SDGA, or you need some support around that, please feel free to reach out. EIC is here as a resource, and I'm sure other folks here as well would love for you to get in touch with the work that they're doing. So I'll leave it at that tonight, and this wraps up our whole series. So again, 3 cheers to Erica for carrying us through, and all of our speakers who've been here. Thank you so much, everyone, and for everyone who shared your questions. Hopefully we'll see you all again very soon. Have a good night.